So this is going to be a quick review for Exam 1. I'll start off with the slides from Chapter 1. All of these definitions are important for you to have a good handle on, and so be familiar with all of them. Not so much this slide. Don't talk about position trade-off fit at all in the exam. And this slide is important. Your understanding of hypercompetition is something I want you to focus in on. The next two slides are the general introduction to the IO school, which is, again, which leads us to Porter's five forces, and then also the resource-based view. And the differences between them and the commonalities among them is something that you're going to want to be familiar with. There's going to be a few questions in the exam on that. I talked about vision and mission. I don't need to dive much into the mission portion, but you do want to be familiar with a vision and what it can do for you and how you can have a good vision statement. And likewise, stakeholders. There are several questions on stakeholders. Who belongs to what group? What interests do those types of groups typically have, and how do those interests perhaps compete with one another are things that you're going to want to be familiar with. And really nothing on strategic leaders on the exam, and obviously nothing from the video. So that covers the Chapter 1 review. I'm going to stop the tape and be back with the Chapter 2 review. On to Chapter 2. Again, I'll be honest with you, it's going to be hard to give you a concise recommendation of what to study because there are a lot of application questions out of the textbook in Chapter 2, and you're just going to have to know a little bit about a lot of different things to be able to answer them. So remember, we talked about the general environment, and I'd like you to be roughly familiar with what is in each of these aspects of the general environment. And then we talked about the industry environment. This is Porter's five forces. Make sure that you're familiar with the definition of what an industry is. And then as we go into the Porter's five forces, again, there are a lot of application questions on these. So you need to be familiar with what is in each of the groups and how they affect what goes on, because what you're going to find is just, again, several application questions. So be familiar with all of these things and be fairly conversant with the differences between them. Again, the buyer and the supplier look very similar. They're kind of a power thing. Substitute products, I don't remember a question directly on substitute products, but I can't guarantee you that there isn't something about substitute products that you're not going to want to know. If nothing else, to know that something about substitute products is wrong. And then there are several questions about rivalry among competitors. Also, don't forget complementers and their role in the Porter's five forces. I'm just glancing down to make sure I've got everything that I need to cover here. As far as strategic groups, be familiar with strategic groups and why firms are put into specific strategic groups and how the idea of studying strategic groups can be useful as you do your analysis. And then speaking of competitors, you're going to want to be familiar with the competitor analysis and specifically what sorts of things are fair or not in a competitive intelligence sort of domain. And also at a very general level, you want to be familiar with scanning, monitoring, competitive intelligence, and forecasts. And that's Chapter 3. Chapter 2. And finally on to Chapter 3. Again, this is something that I can't give you always precise guidance because there's going to be lots of application questions. So this idea of consumer value and understanding that is very important. Like I said, there's no questions on this on the exam. That can be a kind of a messy reading section. But there are several questions. They're going to understand you knowing what tangible, intangible are, what fits in those categories, and why intangible resources are seen as a better part of competitive advantage. Then the ability to apply this concept of this chart and this idea of what makes things hard to imitate and then without substitutes is going to be important in several cases. There are a couple of questions about the value chain. Well, I say one or two questions about the value chain. And again, they're not so much just spit it back at me as it is understanding. Outsourcing and why companies would want to outsource and why it could work well is one or two questions. And then this idea of how putting it all together of what do you do when you get the external and the internal analysis, what do you do and what is it useful for? Okay, I know that's pretty quick. That should, but trust me, I've pointed you in the direction of all the exam questions, many of which you've already seen on your quizzes. Just as a reminder, it's going to be 40 questions, all multiple choice. You can prepare a one-page, one-side only cheat sheet, quote unquote, but the exam itself will be closed book, and I will see you in room 306 on Wednesday.